Fire and Blood for me is a very interesting book, thanks to how it presents conflicting events, leading each reader to end up with their own version of what happens. My version of Fire and Blood could be very different to yours, based on the sources we believe and the choices we make when it comes to Fire and Blood sources of information. It comes down to the fact that Fire and Blood is an in-world history book, and while you get a solid idea of events that happen and a feeling for who the characters were based on their actions and what others have said of them, the nature of the book means that many huge influential events and their details are left intentionally vague. This vagueness and loose characterization means that adapting a history book such as Fire and Blood was always going to present challenges when adapting it to screen for House of the Dragon. In this video, I want to talk about the idea that House of the Dragon was always going to need to expand greatly on the framework that Fire and Blood gives the writers in order to make a complete and engaging story with enough meat and content to allow hour-long episodes telling the story over multiple seasons. Fire and Blood provides a fantastic framework and structure, but it was going to be a tough task to flesh it out. I recently began watching Season 1 of House of the Dragon for the first time again since maybe November. Watching Episode 1 really helped me understand the importance of this fleshing out, and Episode 1 gives us a perfect example of how they executed it in practice, and that is the death of Aemma Arryn and the impact it has on the characters, and thus the drama that it creates. In Fire and Blood, all we really know of Aemma Arryn's death can be summarized in a single sentence. She died during childbirth, with her baby son Balon not surviving her. Other than that, we know little of the context and impact her death has on the characters as people. Aemma Arryn's death happened in House of the Dragon, but the way the show handles this is so much more dramatic and important to the characters personally than you could imagine from the cold historical text of Fire and Blood. I'm not easily shocked or caught off guard. Well, Aemma Arryn's death certainly did catch me off guard. From the first moment we meet Aemma, the show really does a good job at establishing her relationship with both Rhaenyra and Viserys. From her interaction with Viserys, they establish very quickly that she's had a history of traumatic births and stillborns, setting a precedent that this upcoming birth may not be as easy as Viserys is thinking. In contrast, we then have Viserys, who's treating the birth of a son as a foregone conclusion, pushing forward with the heirs tourney, despite warnings of the Maesters and the Small Council against it. This does make sense, given his confidence in his dream of a son on the throne, but these two contrasting viewpoints set up the disaster to come beautifully. There's a conversation between Aemma and Viserys that speaks a lot towards both their characters. Aemma tells Viserys no matter how the birth pans out, this is the last time she's doing it, that she cannot physically or mentally handle another pregnancy. You then have Viserys, brimming with confidence, in a way minimizing his wife's fears, almost as if he's trying to bury his head in the sand, something that is shown to be a deep-rooted character trait. Rather than face the reality of the situation or handle a difficult or troubling issue, he would rather ignore the issue and hope for the best. Aemma Arryn's death is so much more horrific than I could have possibly imagined when I read Fire and Blood. The brutality of it genuinely shocked me the first time I was watching it. Obviously, I knew she was going to die giving birth, or in the aftermath, but I did not expect it to happen the way it did. After seeing it for the first and even the second time, I really did feel it was needlessly brutal, and I do think that is a fair assessment and viewpoint to have. But after some reflection, it really does to me seem like it serves a purpose in shaping the character of Viserys, and how we as an audience view him in turn. His choice in that moment tells us who he truly is as a person and what's important to him when it comes down to it. Yes, of course, I still do question the level of brutality, but I can now begin to understand the purpose of it and kind of what the writers were going for and intended with such a brutal approach to Aemma Arryn's death. It sets up Viserys as a character, but it also, of course, has a huge impact on Rhaenyra as well. It's the loss of Aemma Arryn and the guilt Viserys feels in the aftermath that I think leads him to naming Rhaenyra as his heir in some regard, and also perhaps why later on he's very reluctant to take that away from her. Yes, Daemon's actions are also a factor as well, but I do think it's partly motivated by this guilt he feels. I think this is also why he distances himself from his daughter for months after Aemma's death, which in a way creates the underlying distance between father and daughter. I'm not sure how much Rhaenyra knows about her mother's death. My interpretation is she doesn't really know the full details of exactly how Aemma dies, or the choice her father made. No matter what you feel about the death of Aemma Arryn and its brutality, one aspect of it I did think was interesting is it really highlights the harsh reality and dangers of childbirth in a medieval society where stillbirths, infant mortality and deaths of mothers was fairly commonplace when compared to our modern standard. In other fantasy fiction, and even some historical fiction, this difficult subject matter has often been dealt with, and in a variety of different ways, but I cannot think of a book or a TV show that has handled it in such a traumatic way, because the sad reality is, there were some women who faced similar fates to Aemma Arryn in real life. Now, in terms of the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, and the expanded lore of it, off the top of my head, the two closest comparisons we have to Aemma's death would perhaps be the death of Lyanna Stark, supposedly in childbirth if events in the books play out the same as they did in the show. But again, it does not seem that Lyanna's death is so traumatic when compared to Aemma's fate. In terms of pure book, off the top of my head, I guess Alyssa Velaryon, the mother of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, dying in childbirth, giving birth to Jocelyn Baratheon, is quite similar to Aemma Arryn's show death. In fact, it's almost like Alyssa's death is maybe what inspired Aemma's, and maybe where they got a lot of the ideas from. Alyssa had been in labour for hours and had reached a point that the maesters confirmed nothing more could be done, and regardless, Alyssa would die. You have her husband, Rhaegar Baratheon, faced with the choice of saving his child at the cost of killing his wife in the process. The key difference here is in some accounts, Alyssa consented to the operation, and in others, she never woke from sleeping drugs she was given to calm her, wherein Aemma's case, Viserys makes that choice for Aemma, even though she had capacity to make that decision and choice herself. While exhausted, she was still conscious and able to make the decision herself if consulted. And I guess another big difference is Jaehaerys and Alysanne were both present, and in fact pushed Rhaegar to make a choice, as he found himself unable. Alyssa's children being involved takes the burden of guilt somewhat off Rhaegar. The other big difference is the baby lives, but there are enough similar details to suspect that the death of Alyssa Velaryon influenced the death of Aemma Arryn in the show to some degree. The death of Aemma Arryn divided opinion for a lot of viewers with its brutality, and I think everyone is entitled to their own view on it. But what I can say is this: the death of Aemma Arryn is described in a single sentence in Fire and Blood. What House of the Dragon did was take that single line and add context and substance around it as a way to drive the plot of the show and help establish key characters, having far-reaching impacts on their relationships over the course of the season. This is one example of what the writers had to do with House of the Dragon to bring Fire and Blood to life on screen, taking the outline and details the book provides and turning it into a full and fleshed out story. This was perhaps the biggest challenge the writers faced adapting Fire and Blood, and while I don't agree with a fair few choices the writers did make, they handled the transition from page to screen much better than I thought they would going into episode 1.